Yeah, I mean, eventually I haven't been good enough, and unfortunately it's been more quality than not that I find myself here saying that it could have been, it should have been, but at the end of the day, if I don't do the job inside the car and I don't put all my corners, my best corners together, then I ended up P6 instead of being on the front row. So I can only blame myself. I'm very disappointed because quali used to be one of my strengths. I feel like generally since quite a bit now I'm performing very well in races, but in qualifying I'm missing something.
Can a single phrase destroy the confidence of an entire team? What Charles Leclerc said on radio left Hamilton perplexed and Ferrari in complete shock. What really happens inside Maranello? The classification of the Great Britain 2025 prize seemed to consolidate Ferrari's competitive resurgence. After a free training session 3 dominated by Charles Leclerc, optimism floated in the red garage. Not only had he registered the best time in the session, but he did it with a consistency that made a possible attack on pole. The conditions of the Silverstone circuit were ideal. Stable temperature, controlled wind, and a track that favored the aerodynamic behavior of the most balanced cars. Leclerc, fine at the wheel, seemed to have recovered that mystical connection with the car that has so often raised it above the circumstances. But what followed was an unpublished emotional collapse even for a hot-blood pilot like Monegasco. When crossing the finish line and see his name in the 6th position, the rage seized his mind. In a visceral outbreak, completely outside any media filter, he launched a sequence of expletives on the radio of the equipment. The language was so explicit that the official transmission censored it, but the leaks from the paddock soon circulated. "I am so fucking shit," he repeated several times as if he were publicly punished in front of the entire world. That message was not just an emotional download. It was an unequivocal sign that the situation in Ferrari was going from his hands. The most shocking thing about its reaction was not the intensity but the context. Leclerc is not an impulsive rookie. He is an experienced pilot, accustomed to Ferrari's pressure, connoisseur of the historical weight of dressing red. But this time something was different. The self-destructive language, the tone of hopelessness, and the lack of emotional containment reflected a much more serious internal fracture. "I was not simply upset by an error. It was on the verge of psychological collapse, a mixture of impotence and disappointment accumulated by weeks of efforts without reward." This outburst became a kind of silent earthquake inside the paddock. Rival teams, journalists, and even Maranello's own engineers were perplexed. Lewis Hamilton, his teammate and debutant in Ferrari, watched him from the other side of the garage with a mixture of surprise and confusion. The intensity of the moment became evident when the box atmosphere froze for a few minutes. No one knew how to react. What should be a simple classification ended up becoming a brutal mirror that reflected the background problems of the equipment. This outbreak highlighted a latent tension that had been cooking from the beginning of the season. Because it was not the first time that Leclerc expressed frustration, but never before had reached such a level of vulnerability. His cry, beyond insult, was a symbolic surrender. An elite pilot recognizing, even momentarily, that he no longer feels able to reverse the situation. And that, in a team like Ferrari, can have devastating repercussions. The most worrying thing for Maranello is not that his pilot feels frustrated. It is that, after showing signals of competitiveness, the fall was even more painful. The classification in 6th position, in a circuit where it had been quick in each previous session, was perceived as a betrayal of the car. And when the car betrays you, trust disappears. That is the true tragedy of this block of the season. The trust between Leclerc and the SF25 is broken. And perhaps the most dangerous thing is that neither he nor the team knows how to repair it. After the emotional burst of Leclerc, the cameras and the microphones were waiting for him. The face was the same that crossed the finish line in 6th position, but its tone was more measured. Already without the adrenaline of the moment, Charles tried to offer a more technical explanation, although the background remained as disturbing. "It's not a balance problem, it's not a grip problem. It's something very strange," he said. With that phrase, what he did was open a dangerous door for the ghosts that Ferrari has tried to ignore for months. The root of the problem seems to be in a critical zone of the car: the flat background and the management of the plank wear. Technically, the bottom of the car is one of the components most punished by the new aerodynamic regulations. Any irregularity in its work can compromise compliance with technical regulations, as happened to Hamilton in China, when it was disqualified after a good performance. For Ferrari, that ghost is around every weekend, forcing them to lift the foot of the accelerator at key moments, with conservative strategies of lift and coast that limit the real performance of the car. The paradox is brutal. The SF25 is fast in certain conditions. Its speed in a straight line and its tensile capacity in slow outputs remain competitive. But in fast curves, where sustained aerodynamic stability is needed, the car shows erratic behavior. Leclerc suffers more than Hamilton, perhaps because his pilot style depends more on the total commitment of the car with the front train in high speed. If the car responds badly at that point, your trust disintegrates. Internally, engineers have identified an aerodynamic oscillation phenomenon that affects the car when it crosses combined lateral load areas. In simple terms, the SF25 suffers a loss of load at critical times of the turn, which cannot be predicted with current simulation tools. This inconsistency forces to make configuration decisions that compromise other aspects of the car, such as the degradation of tires or the slow curve. And that adjustment waterfall is exactly what led to SF25 to its contradictory behavior in Silverstone. A car with good tip speed, but unstable and nervous where security was most needed. The most alarming thing is that Ferrari has already invested considerable resources in solving this anomaly. The new floor introduced in Austria should be the solution. Designed with deeper aerodynamic channels and greater structural rigidity, it promised to stabilize the airflow under the car in high-load situations. But post-carrier data were clear. The improvement was marginal and, in conditions such as those of Silverstone, insufficient. The team was waiting for a step forward, but what they obtained was a flat performance curve. These types of problems are not solved with last-minute adjustments. They require structural redesign, weeks of wind tunnel and validation by simulation of computational fluid dynamics, CFD. And in the meantime, every weekend that passes, the pilots feel more exposed, more vulnerable and more desperate to find answers. Leclerc's frustration is not isolated. Hamilton has also privately expressed the difficulty of finding a balance that remains stable between sessions. But while the British adopts a more clinical approach, Monegasco lives each turn as a sentence. The emotional difference between the two is abysmal, and in this context, Ferrari runs the risk of losing more than races. The terrain could be sowing for a structural fracture between its two main figures that he observed Leclerc's drama from a prudent distance, as if trying to find his place in the middle of chaos. And although he has been in Formula One for more than 15 years, this moment was unique. He had never seen a teammate self-destruct so openly in front of the cameras. The most shocking thing is that, for the first time, Hamilton was not the center of attention in a weekend marked by Ferrari's internal tension. Since his arrival, Lewis has insisted that his goal is to build something big with Ferrari. He has spoken of legacy, inspiration, and reliving the greatness of the rampant Cavallino. But Silverstone showed him a reality that was not in his plans. A divided team, emotionally volatile, and with technical problems that his engineers still do not understand at all. What seemed like an exciting challenge now began to look dangerously to an uphill battle. Technically, Hamilton did not have a bad classification. It was relatively close to the rhythm of Leclerc, and its process of adaptation to SF25 has been faster than many expected. However, that individual improvement was totally eclipsed by the emotional implosion of his partner. It was as if everything built in recent weeks collapsed in a single radio message. And that, for a methodical and strategic pilot like Hamilton, represents a much more serious threat than any rival on the track. The most revealing thing is that internally, several engineers have begun to refer to Hamilton as the equipment stabilizer. His experience, his emotional control, and above all, his ability to translate technical problems into concrete actions, have begun to be seen as the true added value of their signing. While Leclerc reacts from the emotional, Lewis acts from the diagnosis. While one shouts in a vacuum, the other questions what data does not fit. This focus difference could become the only salvation table for Ferrari if they decide to listen more thoroughly what Hamilton is already beginning to propose. But here is the irony. So that Lewis can save Ferrari, Ferrari has to allow him to do so. And that implies a cultural change that Scuderia has not proven to be ready to execute. It requires giving control, listening to an external voice with authority, and above all, accepting that the British pilot did not arrive to join, but to transform. What happened in the Silverstone classification was not a simple bad result or a passing tantrum. It was a statement, not only verbal but emotional and structural, that something very serious is broken inside Ferrari. Leclerc did not speak from rage, spoke from despair. And when a pilot of that caliber, in that position, crumbles like this, you have to read between the lines. What is at stake is not a grill position. It is the trust between pilot, equipment, and machine. It is the viability of a project that should be the renaissance of Ferrari and that today seems to the edge of collapse. The SF25 has been more than a difficult car. It has been a source of constant frustration for both pilots. But while Hamilton transforms that difficulty into learning and clinical approach, Leclerc lives it as a personal betrayal. This reaction difference says a lot about how each perceives their role within the team and how can influence the future of the season. Now, the big question in the air is this: how does Ferrari answer to this? Will they dare to redefine your internal hierarchy? Will they have the humility of restructuring their technical process? Or will they simply continue to sail in aerodynamic patches, cosmetic changes and promises of improvement without real depth? And you, who have followed this story until the end, do you think Leclerc did well to explode in that way? Or do you think he crossed a line that could affect its credibility inside and outside the team? Leave it in the comments.